All right, folks, you are not going to believe this.
Yeah.
One President Trump just held a press conference.
Yeah.
And get this, he talked about wanting to, like, acquire Greenland,
Oh, wow.
the Panama Canal in Canada. It's
Hmm.
like he's playing Risk and decided to go for global domination.
You know what's striking to me is the way he framed these ambitions. It wasn't like,
Wow, yeah.
about diplomacy or negotiation or anything like that. He was talking about using economic force.
Wow.
And he even refused to rule out military action, even when it came to Greenland, which is, tied to a NATO ally.
Okay, so maybe he just really, really loves those little colored territories on the Risk board.
All right.
But seriously, though, this is causing a major international stir.
Uh-huh.
And we've got a stack of news articles and opinion pieces here breaking it all down.
Oh, good.
So
Let's unpack this
Yeah.
step by step. First, the specifics. What did he actually say?
Right.
Well, Trump said he wants to make Canada the 51st state.
What?
He suggested that the Panama Canal is operated by China, which is totally false. And he even floated renaming the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America.
It's like he's trying to redraw the map of North America with a Sharpie.
Yeah.
So what was the reaction from world leaders?
Let's just say they weren't exactly thrilled. Trudeau, before stepping down,
Yeah.
was very, very clear that Canada has absolutely zero interest in joining the U.S. The president of Panama issued a very firm statement saying the canal belongs to Panama, end of story,
Okay.
and Denmark. They're basically like, Greenland is not for sale. What even is happening right now?
So besides the obvious this is completely bonkers factor,
Yeah.
what are the real-world implications
Right.
of these statements?
Well, wait, for starters, this goes way beyond just some off-the-cuff remarks.
Yeah.
These pronouncements are raising serious questions about Trump's commitment to international law and, the future of U.S. foreign policy.
And then there's the whole NATO angle, right?
Mm.
Because if Trump seriously considers using force
Yeah.
against Greenland, a territory under Denmark's control, that could potentially trigger Article 5 of the NATO treaty.
Exactly. Article 5 is the Collective Defense Agreement of NATO.
Right.
It basically means that an attack on one member is considered an attack on all members.
Got it.
So if Trump were to move against Greenland,
Yeah.
he'd essentially be picking a fight with the entire NATO alliance.
Hold on, back up for a second. For those of us who don't have our international relations PhDs,
Okay.
could you break down exactly what Article 5 means
Sure.
and why it's such a big deal?
Imagine NATO as a neighborhood watch,
Okay.
where everyone agrees to protect each other. Article 5 is the core of that agreement. It means if one house gets robbed,
Right.
all the neighbors band together to help.
Got it.
In this case, if Trump were to attack Greenland, it would be like him robbing Denmark's house,
Yeah.
while simultaneously claiming to be part of the neighborhood watch. It just doesn't compute.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
So essentially, Trump is threatening to break the Neighborhood Watch Agreement.
Right.
But wasn't he already trying to pull the U.S. out of NATO during his first term?
He certainly made noises about it.
Right.
But Congress pushed back hard. They saw leaving NATO as a major strategic blunder.
Yeah.
It would weaken America's global standing and embolden adversaries like Russia.
So maybe this is his roundabout way of undermining NATO. If he can't officially leave,
Yeah.
maybe he can create enough internal chaos to render it ineffective.
It's a chilling thought.
Right.
But it's not outside the realm of possibility. Remember, Trump has shown a consistent pattern
Yeah.
of disregarding international norms and agreements.
And let's not forget the curious case of Donald Trump Jr. showing up in Greenland
Oh, yeah.
and handing out "Make Greenland Great Again" hats. I mean, is that supposed to be some kind of charm offensive?
It's baffling, to say the least.
Right.
On one hand, you have the president talking about using force.
Uh-huh.
And then on the other, you have his son playing tourist,
Right.
trying to win hearts and minds with magiats. It just adds another layer of bizarre to an already perplexing situation.
Okay, so we've got territorial ambitions, threats of force NATO on the brink,
Right.
and Maggie hats in Greenland.
Mm-hmm.
Where do we even go from here?
Yeah.
This is starting to feel like a political thriller gone wrong.
Well, to understand the potential consequences of all this,
Yeah.
we need to look at the historical context of American expansionism.
Right.
It's not exactly a new phenomenon,
Uh-huh.
but the way Trump is going about it is certainly raising eyebrows.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to things like Spanish-American War, the
Mhm.
annexation of Hawaii,
Mm.
even the Panama Canal, which, by the way, already happened once
Right.
and didn't end well for Panama.
Yeah.
So where does that leave us in terms of understanding what Trump might actually do?
That's a great question, and honestly, it's a bit unsettling
Yeah.
because there are some historical parallels here that are worth considering.
Right.
Think back to the late 19th century and the Spanish-American War.
Yeah.
The U.S. emerged from that conflict with control of places like the Philippines,
Wow.
Guam, and Puerto Rico.
Right. And that whole era was fueled by this idea of manifest destiny, the belief that America was destined to expand its dominion. It's like Trump is channeling some kind of 21st century version of that.
It's a disturbing thought, but it's hard to ignore the similarities, and the fact that he's openly talking about using economic force and not ruling out military options, that's a pretty big departure from the kind of diplomacy and multilateralism that has generally characterized U.S. foreign policy for decades.
To be fair, there are some experts who argue that this is all just bluster, a negotiating tactic to get better deals for the U.S. Maybe he's playing 4D chess while the rest of us are stuck on checkers.
It's possible, but I think it's a dangerous gamble. Because even if his intentions aren't to actually invade or annex these places, the rhetoric itself is already causing damage. It's creating uncertainty, undermining trust with allies, and emboldening adversaries who see this as a sign of American weakness or instability.
You mentioned uncertainty, and I think that's a key point here. Because it's not just world leaders who are scratching their heads. This has created a whole lot of anxiety for everyday people, too. The articles you shared paint a pretty vivid picture of the global reaction.
Absolutely. The Washington Post article, for instance, talks about how this is fueling a sense of unease in Europe. They're worried that Trump is serious about unraveling the transatlantic alliance, and they're not sure what to do about it.
Yeah, and the Irish Times piece really drives home that point. They argue that Europe might be kidding itself if it thinks it can control or manage Trump in this second term. They're basically saying, buckle up, folks. It's going to be a bumpy ride.
Their concern is that Trump doesn't even need to formally withdraw from NATO to cause significant damage. His words and actions alone can undermine the alliance's credibility and create openings for adversaries like Russia to exploit.
Okay, so NATO is freaking out. Canada is saying thanks but no thanks to becoming America's hat. And Panama's like, don't even think about it. But what about the average American? How are people reacting to all of this?
Well, the reactions are definitely mixed. Some people support Trump's tough stance, arguing that he's finally putting America's interests first. They see this as a sign of strength and a necessary correction to what they perceive as decades of weak foreign policy.
And then there are those who are deeply concerned about the potential consequences of this kind of aggressive unilateral approach.
Exactly. They're worried about the damage to America's reputation, the potential for conflict, and the long-term implications for global stability.
So it sounds like this goes way beyond just some quirky comments from the president. We're talking about a fundamental shift in how America sees its role in the world. And it seems like that shift is causing major ripples, both domestically and internationally.
Right. And this brings us to another crucial aspect of this story, the economic angle. Because Trump has repeatedly justified these territorial ambitions by citing economic security as the primary motivation.
Which on the surface might sound reasonable. After all, who doesn't want economic security? But what does that actually mean in this context? Is he suggesting that the U.S. needs to grab more land and resources to stay ahead economically?
That seems to be the underlying message. But it raises some important questions about the balance between national interests and adherence to international law and treaties.
And it also makes you wonder what happens if other countries start adopting the same economic security at all costs approach.
That's a recipe for chaos and conflict. If everyone starts grabbing whatever they can, regardless of the rules, then the whole system breaks down. And it's worth noting that Trump's actions are already having a tangible impact on U.S. relations with countries like Canada.
Right. The Atlantic article we have dives into that, particularly in the context of Justin Trudeau's recent resignation. They argue that while there were certainly other factors at play, Trump's aggressive posture toward Canada definitely didn't help matters, especially those threats to impose tariffs.
It's a classic case of the bully pulpit backfiring. Trump might have thought he was applying pressure to get a better deal, but instead he alienated a key ally and arguably contributed to Trudeau's political downfall.
So in a sense, Trump's actions are pushing allies away rather than drawing them closer.
That's one of the unintended consequences of this America First approach taken to an extreme. It can lead to isolation rather than strength.
But how does Panama fit into all of this? I mean, the Panama Canal is already under Panamanian control. What's Trump's angle there?
Well, remember that quote where he said the canal is operated by China? That's completely false, but it gives us a glimpse into his thinking. He seems to view everything through this lens of competition and dominance, and Panama, with its strategic importance for global trade, represents a key asset in that game.
So he's basically saying, that looks like a nice canal you've got there. It would be a shame if something happened to it.
It's a dangerous line of thinking, and it has historical precedent. We can't forget that the U.S. has a long and complicated history with Panama, including the 1989 invasion that was widely condemned by the international community.
Right, and that brings us to the Guardian article, which quotes Panama's president as saying that every square meter of the canal belongs to Panama. He's basically drawing a line in the sand and saying, don't even think about it.
And that's a significant statement, especially given the power imbalance between the U.S. and Panama. It shows that even smaller countries are willing to push back against what they perceive as bullying tactics.
This is all starting to feel very precarious. It's like we're teetering on the edge of something really unsettling.
I think that's a fair assessment, and it raises a crucial question. Is Trump truly aware of the potential consequences of his actions? Or is this a calculated gamble? Is he deliberately trying to disrupt the existing world order?
It's a question that takes us right to the heart of what's so unsettling about this entire situation. Because we're not just talking about policy disagreements or diplomatic blunders here. We're talking about something much deeper, a fundamental clash of values and worldviews.
Precisely. And that clash has the potential to reshape the geopolitical landscape in ways that are difficult to predict.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about NATO historical parallels, economic security, and the reactions from around the globe. But what does it all mean for the listener, for us, trying to understand this complex situation? What are the key takeaways?
Well, first and foremost, it seems clear that Trump's second term will likely be marked by a much more assertive and some might say aggressive approach to foreign policy. His America First ideology is taking on a more expansionist and unilateral tone.
And this is causing friction with allies and raising concerns about the potential for conflict, particularly with his comments about using force against Greenland.
Exactly. His willingness to challenge international norms and disregard existing treaties is also a major concern. It creates uncertainty and instability on the global stage.
And it makes it incredibly difficult to predict what he might do next.
That's a key takeaway here. We're entering uncharted territory, and the stakes are incredibly high.
So as we move into the final part of this deep dive, we need to consider the potential consequences of Trump's actions. What kind of world is he shaping with these pronouncements, and what does it mean for the future of international relations? Stay with us because the conversation is just getting started. Okay, so we've dissected Trump's statements, we've explored the global fallout, we even delved into the historical context.
Yeah.
But the big question remains, what happens next?
Right.
What are the long-term consequences of this America First on steroids approach?
Well, one way to look at it is through the lens of global power dynamics.
Okay.
We're living in an era where the traditional rules-based international order is being challenged, and Trump's actions seem to be accelerating that trend.
You're talking about the system that emerged after World War II.
Yeah.
With institutions like the United Nations and NATO?
Exactly. That system, while imperfect, has been relatively successful in preventing large-scale conflicts and fostering global cooperation.
Yeah.
But it relies on a shared understanding of norms, rules, and institutions. And Trump, with his America First agenda, seems to be saying, those rules don't apply to me.
So what happens when the most powerful country in the world decides to go rogue?
It creates a vacuum, an opportunity for other actors to step in and fill the void. And those actors might not share the same values or commitment to democratic principles.
We're talking about countries like China and Russia.
Exactly. They're already taking advantage of this situation, expanding their influence and challenging American leadership on the world stage. And the more Trump undermines institutions like NATO, the more he plays into their hands.
So in a sense, he's weakening America's position by trying to make it stronger.
That's the paradox. By alienating allies and disregarding international norms, he's actually undermining America's long-term interests. He's creating a world where might makes that along. And in that kind of world, it's not clear that the U.S. will always come out on top.
It's like he's playing a dangerous game of chicken with the global order. But let's get back to the specifics. What about those particular territories that he mentioned, Greenland, Canada, Panama? What are the consequences of him actually trying to make a move on any of those?
Well, it's important to remember that none of these places are just sitting around waiting to be acquired. They have their own interests, alliances, and populations who would likely resist any attempt at annexation or takeover.
Right, we already talked about the strong reactions from those countries.
Exactly.
But let's say, hypothetically, Trump decides to push the issue.
Okay.
What could that look like in reality?
Well, the Greenland scenario is particularly worrying because of the potential NATO implications. If Trump were to use force against Greenland, a territory linked to a NATO member, it could trigger Article 5 and draw the entire alliance into a conflict.
And as you explained earlier, that would be a complete disaster.
Yeah.
Not only would it, shatter NATO,
Right.
but it would also put the U.S. at odds with some of its closest allies.
Exactly. And it's hard to see how that would benefit anyone.
Right.
Least of all the United States. The economic and geopolitical costs would be enormous.
So Greenland is probably a no-go, at least from a military standpoint.
Yeah.
What about Canada? Could Trump actually force Canada to become part of the U.S.?
It's highly unlikely.
Yeah.
First of all, it would require a constitutional amendment.
Right.
Which is a lengthy and complex process. And even if that were somehow possible,
Yeah.
it's hard to imagine the Canadian people just accepting it.
They probably put up more of a fight than a hockey team losing the Stanley Cup.
Exactly. And any attempt to force annexation would likely lead to widespread resistance, potentially even armed conflict. So from a practical standpoint, it just doesn't seem feasible.
Okay, so let's move on to Panama. The Panama Canal is obviously a strategically important asset.
Yeah.
Could Trump try to seize control of it?
Well, he could certainly try, but it would be a blatant violation of international law.
Right.
And would likely face strong condemnation from the international community. Remember, the canal was transferred to Panamanian control back in 1999 under a treaty ratified by the U.S. Senate.
So breaking that treaty would be a major diplomatic blow to the U.S.
Absolutely. And it would further erode America's credibility and trustworthiness on the world stage.
Yeah.
Other countries would be wary of entering into agreements with a nation that so casually disregards its commitments.
So if we're looking at the big picture here, it seems like Trump's pronouncements, while alarming, are probably more bark than bite. He might talk a tough game, but actually trying to seize these territories would be incredibly difficult and costly, both in terms of international relations and potential conflict.
That's a reasonable assessment. However, we can't ignore the fact that his rhetoric is already having a negative impact.
Right.
It's creating uncertainty, undermining alliances, and emboldening America's adversaries.
And it's raising some fundamental questions about the direction of U.S. foreign policy.
Exactly.
And the future of the global order.
This is not just about Trump's personal ambitions or his America First agenda.
Yeah.
This is about the kind of world we want to live in. A world where rules matter, where diplomacy prevails, and where countries cooperate to address shared challenges. Or a world where might makes right and the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must.
Those are some pretty stark choices.
Yeah.
And it seems like the path we're on right now is leading us toward a more unstable and unpredictable future.
It's a sobering thought, but it's also a call to action.
Yeah.
We can't just sit back and watch this unfold. We need to engage in informed discussions, hold our leaders accountable, and work towards a more just and peaceful world.
Well said. And on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a wild ride.
Yeah.
But I think we've shed some light on a very complex and concerning situation.
It's been my pleasure. I think it's crucial for us to keep asking tough questions, to challenge assumptions, and to never take our freedoms or our global interconnectedness for granted.
Remember, knowledge is power. And the more we understand about the forces shaping our world, the better equipped we are to navigate the challenges ahead.
Thanks for listening.